Hello, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Fiveable live stream. And hopefully you're coming fresh off the heels of studying some APUSH. Maybe either way, it's time to go live. Let's talk about it. Glad you're here. And my name is Mr. Lagerway, and I'm an APUSH teacher from Michigan. Some of my students are in the chat, it looks like. Hey there. Just to make sure everything's dates you want to add to the chat that you think are particularly important. 1812, 1861, 1870. Yeah, 1776, July 4, of course. Decades are also important. Thank you, Aaron. Yes. 1920s and the 1930s and other ones. 1914, 1850, 1920 itself, 1763. Excellent. Excellent. Sounds like you folks are well versed on your dates. Excellent. 2001, 1803, 1860s. Sounds good. Sounds good. Well, again, my name is Mr. Lagerway, and I'll be your host this evening as we talk through some APUSH dates and some strategies. So let's jump into it. And I got ourselves some screen sharing again, so some slides to get through to kind of get you going with what we're talking about. So again, this is a Liveable 5 stream, and it's free today, which is fantastic. If you're interested in the archive, obviously Fiveable Plus is always an option. And we're going to be talking about an APUSH study and exam strategy. So obviously using dates is, oh, there's a double and there. We should probably fix that, don't you think? Nothing like live fixing your PowerPoint, right? Well, either way, you want to make sure that you're using dates both to study and to actually do well on the exam itself. So how do we do that? Well, I'm going to lay out a couple strategies for you. And obviously, if you have a question about dates or about the APUSH exam in general, I'll try to answer some of those as I go. I'll try to answer some at the end. And so feel free to put that into the ask a question at the bottom. And let's go through some of that stuff. So you can see other APUSH reviews at Fiveable at any time. Go ahead and join other people there if you'd like to. Follow us on social media. That's always a great place to do it as well. And outline of tonight looks as follows. Periodization and the big picture. Periodization, we're talking here about the College Board and what it looks like and how they structure the 9 periods and why that matters. That's always really important. The big picture. I think using big picture, not getting bogged down in the details, is really important when it comes to the exam and your studying. Presidents. Yeah, there used to be a time when you could just brute memorize all the presidents, spit out a bunch of facts about them, and you'd be totally fine. But unfortunately, that's not the case. I want to tell you how to be a little more strategic about them, but also why it's an incredibly valuable tool. I want to talk about exam applications, give you a couple sample questions. Again, how do you use dates like we did last night? And then also leave some time for questions and concerns. Sound good? All right. We got some questions rolling already. Sounds good. So before we begin and dive into periodization, as always, it's important to stay hydrated. And of course, my famous lamp is making its reappearance in the background. So for those of you that were worried about them, don't worry. The lamps are back, some of which is even visible. So let's go through the periodization. This is history in chunks. And keep in mind that this is a tool that comes from the concept outline, which is the way that the College Board organizes the course, both for students and for teachers. And that's useful. But it's also useful to notice when Dakota, I thought you'd appreciate the lamp. It's also useful to recognize why they made the cuts where they did, right? You need to make sure that you know that 1491 is not the date that Columbus arrived, right? 1491 is symbolic. They even state that in the key concepts. So they say 1491 is symbolic of pre-Columbian Native American societies. It's one of the few symbolic dates that's there, not standing for a specific event, but standing for a chunk of time, although there are a couple other ones what you could argue. So that's a great way to start. And then you get 1607, and let's make sure that we get this going. So 1607, folks, that's an important date in APUSH. If you could drop it in the chat, what's 1607? Why is that an important date to know? How we doing? Sorry if it's glitching for you, Peyton. But let's see, 1607. Ivana wins the prize. Nice work. That is Jamestown. Yes. Remember, Jamestown, things about that are important. I know there's a little bit of a lag, but we're working with it here. And make sure you talk about the English there. So keep in mind that Jamestown is the first permanent English settlement in North America. That's kind of a nice definition, right? The Spanish are here first. See St. Augustine, right? And of course, there's a lot of other smaller settlements with like the Vikings even earlier, but the first permanent English settlement in North America, right? And how does that matter? Well, as Aaron is saying, yeah, that does represent the beginning of the colonization of North America, particularly by the British. And so in my mind, that sets period 1 apart from period 2, right? So period 1 is going to be Native Americans, interaction between Native Americans and Europeans, and then the contest between the Spanish and the Portuguese who are here first, and then the Dutch and the French and the English who come a little bit later. They're hungry, they're thirsty, they want a piece of that gold bullion pie, and they want some sweet New World. And then they discover it's a little bit harder, and Roanoke fails, etc. with the English. So 1607 begins the demarcation, the marker line between an earlier period where it's all about the competition and the interaction, and we start to focus more, not exclusively, on the English presence in North America. Notice the end date, of course, becomes the start date for the next period. So period 2 begins at 1607 and it goes till 1753. Yeah. So 1607 is Jamestown, and then period 2 talks about British North America. It talks about some colonial comparisons as well, but also it starts talking about English colonies and why the English colonies are different. The Chesapeake versus the New England. Perhaps you looked at that short answer question. But there's a lot more focus on the British because they're the ones that settle what eventually becomes the geography of the United States of America. Yeah. So again, if you know some of these big dates, these are the big period dates that you should know on either side. It really helps you to contextualize or to be able to put in context what your questions are. I think these are valuable for studying and also valuable for looking at primary sources, going on the exam. All of that is useful. So 1607 was Jamestown. We got that one okay. I'll give you 1754. 1754 is the beginning of the 7 Years' War, and that is thus the end of salutary neglect. That's going to be the end of the British monarchy just ruling over the colonies in a general colonial way. And so they've been doing the mercantilism thing. Yeah, Kate, French and Indian War, 7 Years' War, same thing, same thing. Esther's asking, do we need to know other colonies, years other than formed in just Jamestown? Perhaps that's useful. I would say probably not. There's not a lot of period 1 and 2 dates you have to know. I would say that 1607 is a really, really nice one because it anchors period 1 and 2, and it's such a pivotal turning point in American history. Other than that, you don't need to know exactly when Pennsylvania is founded, when Massachusetts or the Plymouth colony or things like that. It's more exactly as Aaron said about the regions and their differences. Yeah. So again, as I'm going to emphasize throughout tonight, the APUSH exam does not test you on dates directly, right? They don't require you to know dates. Maybe your Pearl Harbor, December 7 might be a good thing, and maybe 9/11 would be a good thing. But in general, it's dates that help you. Dates help you, right? So you want to make the dates work for you. So if you know some of these basic ones, that's very, very helpful. Very, very helpful. Because keep in mind, you want to be able to have, well, an idea of what's going on, and you want to be able to see. I mean, it's really hard to tell, of course, what is important in some of these early units, right? There's not a whole lot going on. The key concepts might be a little bit sparse, but the dates are a good way to at least put it in where you're supposed to be going. So it should work. Period 2 then is 1607 to 1754. 1754, the beginning of the French and Indian War, beginning of the 7 Years' War. It ends in 1763. Thus, 1763 is the end of salutary neglect, as some people were talking about in the chat there. So keep in mind that 1754 to 1800 in period 4 is going to be important because that's going to be the road to the American Revolution and its aftermath, which is going to be setting up the American government and seeing how that works. Yeah. And yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So let me take a look at some questions, just see what we got popping up to the top here. Yeah, I absolutely think dates are important for context. We'll talk about that a little bit later when it comes to some of the essays. They are very important to know in terms of how events connect together, and you can't properly contextualize if you don't know which events cause which other ones, which ones come first. And that causation, exactly as Aaron is saying, that causation is huge. APUSH is not about memorizing random facts. It's about connecting them together. It's all about making sure that you have the causation, the change over time, Absolutely. Not rote memorization. Yes. And so, yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit more too. Moving on to the end of period 3, the beginning of period 4, 1800. Now, this is the point where I get really excited because you start to have an America that actually exists. No surprise there. Hopefully, everybody knows that the American Revolution ends in 1783. But even if you didn't, for sure by 1800, because why is 1800 important? Lily, you beat me to it and you stole my thunder, and I didn't even get to ask. But absolutely, the Revolution of 1800 and Jefferson. Absolutely. So by 1800, we have the end of the first transition of peaceful power between the Adams administration and the Jefferson administration. The so-called Revolution of 1800 matters because it shows that the American experiment is more than just an ephemeral flash in the pan. It's not going to disappear the first time some people disagree, right? We're going to have some knockdown, drag-out fights and still be able to transition peacefully, and that's amazing. And so 1800 becomes a really big deal, the transition from the Federalists into Jeffersonian democracy. Absolutely. There might be some questions about that. Now, period 4 gets rather large, and again, symbolically, 1800 represents the beginning of Jeffersonian democracy, and I'm more of a Hamilton fan than Jefferson, as some people have pointed out. Yeah, but I can certainly respect Jefferson, an amazing statesman, president for 2 terms, and then eventually you're going to get Jacksonian democracy in there, and period 4 is huge for the building of democracy. And so why do they choose, and let's put this one back into the chat there, why do they choose 1848 as the end date for period 4? See what you can do. 1848 is the end of period 4. Why would they choose that one? It's an important and symbolic date, and it overlaps with period 5. There's some Mexican-American War stuff happening there, perhaps. There's some Seneca Falls Convention happening there, perhaps as well. Yeah, lots of stuff happening in the chat, it looks like. Yeah. Keep in mind, 1848 is multiple things. Now, here's the thing. Those of you that said the Mexican-American War, you're not wrong. You're just not as right as the Seneca Falls Convention people. Here's why. 1848 is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ends the Mexican-American War, right? But the people that made the test, they thought, oh, period 4 is going to be about the antebellum reform movements, the growth of democracy, etc. Lots of people getting involved in abolitionism, in temperance, in women's rights. And of course, women's rights are going to end up with the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. And thus, symbolically, it stands for that. Now, it doesn't really matter. You folks knew a lot of good history. That's fantastic. But do know that if 1848, you should think of at least the Seneca Falls Convention, if not the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But that means you can go back and go, oh, look, we started the period with Jefferson, who was a new party and had a lot of ideas about the common man. And then we ended with Seneca Falls and Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It means the United States has grown up. It means there's been a whole bunch of discussions about who counts as a citizen, right? So there's a whole bunch of things happening in period 4 that are all tied in with that. Moving on to period 5. Period 5 begins in 1844, and this is why I'd put the Mexican-American War in period 5, because 1844 is the election of James Polk, and of course, he's going to be the one that takes us into the Mexican-American War with the sketchy Nueces Strip incident, etc. And so he's going to be the one that's all manifesting our destiny all over the place, and he's going to be really interested in that. So that's 1844, and then 1877. 1877 is the end of Reconstruction. Remember the sketchy compromise between Southern Democrats and Northern Radical Republicans, where they remove federal U.S. troops from the South, and in exchange, they get to have the president be a Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes sometimes. Nice job, Mia. Compromise, end of Reconstruction. Absolutely. Yeah. So basically that means period 5 then is going to be, well, why is the Mexican-American War important? For a lot of reasons, right? Even our border discussions today are going to revolve around this. But I would say another reason it's important is because of the Mexican Cession, as many of you said. So period 5 then becomes the road to the Civil War itself in the middle, and then the aftermath of the Civil War, which is Reconstruction, which ends in 1877. So again, knowing some of these big dates is really helpful if you're able to go, all right, I see something about Reconstruction. When is that approximately happening? Well, you know, it has to be after the Civil War ends in 1865, and it has to be before 1877. So now you've got yourself a 12-year window, and it's really helping out. Absolutely. Absolutely. So then period 6, again, we have another overlap that happens here. Period 6 starts in 1865. That means the end of the Civil War, and it goes until 1898. This is the period that focuses on the second industrial revolution, on the second westward expansion, all of those things. So 1898, that would be the year of the Spanish-American War. Spanish-American War, not the Mexican-American War. Please don't get those confused. The 1865 is the end of the Civil War. And so that's when the United States has this industrial economy that it got during the Civil War, starts to really kickstart. And that begins to mean the United States has a very large economy then. And then 1898, of course, is going to be the Spanish-American War, when we start to focus on going overseas a little bit more. Period 7 overlaps a little bit. They go back to 1890, partly because that's the closing of the frontier. Remember Frederick Jackson Turner? We're talking imperialism and McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, and all that good stuff. Absolutely. And then it goes until 1945. Folks, this is a gigantic period. Notice it's 17% of the instructional time, as it says right here, right? And so this is a gigantic period that encompasses imperialism, progressivism, the World War I, the 20s, the 30s, and the New Deal, and World War II. That's a big deal. It's huge. But World War II ends in 1945. That's a must-know date, a huge turning point. And of course, World War II ending is a big deal. But as somebody already said in the chat, and I'm sorry I missed you, but World War II ending is not just the only thing that happens in 1945. The end of World War II also means the start of the Cold War. That's a big deal. Then you get period 8, which is also fairly large, and that has a lot of stuff going on. It begins with the Cold War, but keep in mind, since 1945 is the start, the Cold War goes over the entire thing. It even outlasts period 8. And the only reason that we're going to use 1980 as the ending is because that's the election of which president in 1980. Help me out. Drop it in the chat. And then I'm going to look at some of these questions that we have going on. So, who got elected in 1980? And why did we start period 9 in 1980? Not Stalin. Reagan. We're flooding the chat with the Gipper. Excellent. Excellent. Yes. So Reagan's all over there. George Washington, by the way, much, much earlier. He leaves office in 1796 and dies in 1799. Ronald Reagan, the movie star. Absolutely. All right. So you folks know Reagan. Period 9 then goes from Reagan to the present. If you watched Mr. Ritchie's period 9 review stream, you know that was all about the conservative resurgence, and thus the tilt to the right the country has been on, with a couple exceptions, since 1980. Absolutely. The age of conservatism is why 1980 is a change. Absolutely. Absolutely. Sure. So that's periodization. And again, I would just like to emphasize here, my point here is to sort of focus your studying. You could obviously be studying tons of dates. Which ones are important? These are the ones that I would start with. My recommendation as a reader, my recommendation as a teacher, my recommendation as a student of history is you got to know these crucial dates, because that'll help you place things into larger chunks. Absolutely. Zoe asked, do we need to study Obama? Answers are mixed. I would say anything after about 2005 or 10 is optional. I wouldn't worry about that too much. You definitely need to know war on terror and the United States' role in the New World after the Cold War. But you can use examples from Obama's presidency. But you really don't want to get into politics or into the current present stuff too much. But you could always use ISIS if there's a short answer question about challenges the United States has faced overseas since the end of the Cold War, something like that. So let me just continue on here. Couple important dates. I have this required dates for APUSH document, and I've shared that with my students. Hopefully you can see that a little bit. If feel free to take a screenshot or something like that if you want to. But there's a whole bunch of dates that are potentially useful. So where do you start? I mean, this is like not even the bare minimum. This is more like a medium sort of thing. So how do you possibly start? Well, using flashcards is a good way to go. Remember, active recall is the best study strategy according to science, right? Make your brain do the connections. Absolutely. At this point, you absolutely need to prioritize. right? You need to be prioritizing and making sure that you're not just brute memorizing all of them. You need to make sure that you're choosing really, really important ones. I will see what I can do about putting up a link. I will see what I can do. So make sure you're prioritizing, because you obviously can't have them all. Emphasize your turning points. Emphasize your turning points. As in, that's why the election of Ronald Reagan's a big deal. The election of Jefferson's a big deal. Absolutely. Yeah, I know you can't see that. It's a little bit harder to see. Wonder if I can maybe, let's see. I'll try to pull it up a second and see if I can make it a little bit bigger for you. So make this a little smaller. Pull up the PDF. How's that? So again, I'm not saying you necessarily, and I will share this link for you folks in a second, but I got this from another teacher. This is not my creation. I stole this thing, but it has a lot of important dates. And yeah, the 5-able APUSH dates to know is fantastic. I would use that. Not a bad way to go, Dakota. Sounds good to me. Let's see what I can do here. So a bunch of different dates that you should know there. And I want to make sure that I can actually share this with you folks. So hang on just a little bit. As you're prioritizing some of these things, notice we have some big turning points, right? Jamestown was a big deal. Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, let me make sure I say that correctly, is a big deal because, remember, that's the transition from indentured servitude to slavery. So that's a big turning point. And one way that's easy to remember that one is that, of course, it's a whole century before the Declaration of Independence. So that's a big deal and a really good turning point. The end of the Treaty of Paris, 1763. 1763 is another gigantic deal. 1763, if you watch any Adam Norris videos, I think he uses the PEEP acronym, and he talks about how it's the Treaty of Paris, it's the proclamation line of 1763, it's Pontiac's Rebellion, it's the end of salutary neglect, all really important. All right, I got the link for you folks. I'm dropping it in the chat. There's the link to that document. It should be able to be viewable for everybody, and there you go. Going down a few other ones, there's a whole bunch of options there. Obviously, knowing the actual Constitution and the Northwest Ordinance, that's a big deal. Transition from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, that's a big deal. You got to know that. And then a couple other transition periods that I would recommend. Let me just make sure I can scroll down here. I would know the 1815 just because that's the end of the Federalist Party, right? There's the Hartford Convention, and they kind of shoot themselves in the foot. So you got to make sure that you know the transition between the first party system and the second party system, which is also why it's useful to know when Andrew Jackson is elected and when we get the era of the common man, the two-party system, et cetera, et cetera. There's period 5 going on. And are you okay with saying the 1760s? Absolutely, GW. Yeah. Here's the thing. If you use a specific date that is very impressive and actually goes a bit toward counting toward your evidence point, but if you don't know it, that's okay. It counts as a minor error if you get it wrong. If you're going into the decade, that's totally fine. Don't psych yourself out if you're like, oh man, some of those British laws that tax a bunch of stuff, that's somewhere in the 1760s, right? That's fine. Totally fine. You want to make sure that you're defining the actual act itself. Make sure you know what the vocab word is, and then it's fine. Yeah. Let me just drop the link one more time in there, so just in case people couldn't find it. And I already sent that message, so I can't send it again. It thinks I'm trying to spam. But go ahead and find it if you need to. So a couple other turning points. Again, end of Reconstruction is a big deal. Remember, Jim Crow begins at the end of Reconstruction. So black codes exist before, and then they do not exist afterwards because they turn into Jim Crow laws. I am going to see what I can do to post that link one more time. Democrats and Republicans switching views. Oh boy. Yeah, that's a turning point. Happens in period 8, although it happens in period 7 a little bit as well, and it happens over time. That is a complicated story. Basically starts in the 1930s with FDR, and then it continues in the 1960s with LBJ, FDR and LBJ with the Great Society and the New Deal, a lot of government spending. They end up alienating a lot of the conservative, fiscally conservative Democrats in their party, who then begin to shift more toward the Republican Party. There's also Barry Goldwater in the 60s and the backlash to the civil rights movement. Very, very complicated. I'm glad other people can share the link. Yeah, other people can share the link because I can't. It's not letting me unless I add some stuff to it. So maybe I'll see if I can do that again. But there it is. Try not to spam it too much. I think we got it now. Thanks for the help, folks. So if you want to look at that, there is the PDF, and you're able to see it. So important dates. Prioritize the turning points, folks, right? At this point, you can't memorize them all, and you really shouldn't have to. This is not drill and kill. This is not one darn thing after another. As I think it was Aaron said in the chat earlier, keep in mind that APUSH is not about memorizing a ton of things. You have to memorize some things, and it's helpful. But APUSH is about historical thinking skills, causation, etc., etc. So emphasize the turning points, know some dates. It's helpful. Emphasize periods and presidents. We already did the periods. Let's do the presidents. All right. So big picture. I like to focus on big periods and big presidents, right? So if you've ever made a one-pager, like there's an example right there, period 9. So you see the Reagan, you see the 9/11. There should be some really big concepts. If you watch our video from last night or you were there, you know that I really like to emphasize big picture stuff using the key concept, right? And so make sure that you know what goes on in period 9. That's a really big deal. Rise of conservatism, end of the Cold War, and the end of the Cold War means all our problems are over. Oh wait, 9/11 happens, and that's a big deal, right? So then we have political parties posters. I've seen some of those before. Let me just click this way. Timelines are often helpful. That's pretty nice. Yeah, APUSH exam has been pre-designed like a billion times. Majorly like twice in the last couple of years, and then there's been some minor tweaks along the way. Yeah, but here's another big picture thing that I really think I want to emphasize with you folks. Long duration events. And Aaron, you are exactly correct. You need a post-2016 test or book. The APUSH redesign in 2016 was a big deal. Yeah, questions from 2000 to 2010, not helpful anymore for the testing style. They're totally different. So long duration events. You need to know some of these. Now, some of these don't even have start and end dates, and that's fine. But I think dates and big picture can really help you, especially with your contextualization, right? So you want to make sure that in your contextualization, you have stuff that's relevant to the time period, right? So let me give you some examples here, and let me go back here. So long duration events, colonization. You got to know that happens during period 1 and 2. Although if you're talking English, it happens during period 2, right? You got to know mercantilism. Mercantilism is a long process that happens during period 2. This is why you don't have an essay. You're not going to have a DBQ from period 2, but you might have an LEQ from period 2. And if it occurs in period 2, mercantilism is happening in the background. It has to be. The navigation acts, right, that are associated with it, the laws that England passes to be able to enforce them. I would say they're useful in all of the different kinds of writings. I think they're equally useful in DBQ, LEQs, SAQs, and the stimulus-based multiple choice questions. All useful. Yeah. So mercantilism is important. The age of, whenever you can talk about the age of Reagan in period 9, you can talk about the age of Jackson in the 1820s, 30s, 40s. You talk about the age of Jefferson. If you get dates and you're like, let's say someone throws out the date of 1817. I don't know what happened in 1817. Shoot. But I do know that's during the age of Jefferson. And thus, we're before Jackson. Let's see. Oh, yeah, the War of 1812 was a few years before, something like that. It's fairly useful. So if you know it as the age of something. The antebellum era, right? Antebellum, Latin for before the war, referring to, of course, before the Civil War. If it's before the Civil War, you better believe that abolitionism is going to be a big topic. Now, maybe the essay that they're asking you to write is all about the market revolution, or it's all about the Second Great Awakening, or it's even about political parties and the second party system, Whigs and Democrats, right? Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, Andrew Jackson. Doesn't really matter, but all of that fits under the antebellum era. So you can still talk about slavery. Absolutely. Absolutely. By the way, I saw some interesting things in the chat going on there. Political parties poster is very helpful. And there is the Monroe era of good feelings era in 1817. You're exactly right, Dan. But if people didn't know that and they're like, oh, that's too technical, that absolutely works. And that still counts as the age of Jefferson, mainly because Monroe, just like Madison, was a protege and followed along in the Jeffersonian mindset. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. And we're talking about that. Let's see. So we got different kinds of long duration events. Antebellum era works, market revolution, already mentioned that. And the second industrial revolution. Folks, if you get anything from period 6, you can mention John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie. Absolutely. Yeah. Sorry, I'm seeing in the chat. Yeah, I am not Tom Ritchie. I am not a Southern fella. I don't have nearly the silky smooth accent. He does some of the more normal streams. I'm doing some bonus streams as we get closer to the exam itself, right? Yes, absolutely. So the second industrial revolution, folks, is going to be a big deal because it changes the way people interact, the way people work, where people work. It changes the U.S. economy. Absolutely. But also keep in mind that it's going on in the background of, as we move west, it's going in the background of all of these Native American problems out west where they keep protesting us taking their land, and then Americans respond, and it's a whole bunch of stuff. It also is in the background as we talk about the unions, as we talk about new immigration. Absolutely, absolutely. Couple other long duration events. Cold War, folks, if it happens in period 8 or in the first part of period 9, the Cold War is in the background. The Cold War is fantastic contextualization for things about feminism, the rise of feminism, the rise of the civil rights movement, the rise of conservatism. Anything that happens from 1945 until 1991 has the Cold War hanging over it. It's really important. Absolutely. And then, of course, globalization in period 9. By the way, so I gave you some examples of some long duration events. Market Revolution, Dakota, that's going to be period 4. I'd say beginning with like Eli Whitney and the Cotton Gin, Lowell Mills kind of stuff. Period 4 is probably good enough. If you're talking about the steamboat, the telegraph in period 4, that's the market revolution. Although Daniel Walker Howell likes to call it the communication and transportation revolution. I won't quibble with that. I think it's a pretty good description either way. Yeah. So we got some good questions happening in the questions. We'll get to those just checking in a second. But first, in the chat, if you have another long duration event that's your go-to for contextualization, drop it in the chat. What other long duration event is a go-to for contextualization? And what other long-term event has a lot happening in it and might be useful for us to think about? Go ahead and drop that in the chat if you haven't thought about that already. In the meanwhile, Brendan asks, has the second industrial revolution ever ended? Yeah, I would say so. Once you invent electricity and nuclear power, it really changes. Jeffersonian era, yeah, we mentioned that, like the age of Jefferson. Civil War, we said Cold War. Reconstruction, Great Depression, Gilded Age, another way to talk about the second industrial revolution, absolutely. Progressive movement, populism, excellent. Yeah, sounds good. Women's rights. I'd quibble with that a little bit. Women's rights keep popping up every so often because they keep saying, hey, don't forget about us. And we men keep forgetting. Imperialism, fantastic. Turn of the century, 1890s to 19-teens. Yeah. Wilson's 14 points is a specific event, but I think you could talk about the era of isolationism that then starts. Absolutely. The era of sectionalism, right? That before the Civil War, as they keep arguing about westward expansion and about slavery at the heart of that whole thing. Absolutely. Absolutely. So that's what, by the way, I feel like I'm answering Lily's question right now there from the chat there. This is why dates and long duration events are really important for contextualization. Yeah. Sounds good. All right. So we also have, do we need to know years and periods, like what years in each period? We kind of went through that at the beginning. I think that's absolutely true. Court cases is kind of a different thing, but we'll see what we can do there. I don't think any of you are going to fail, so I won't even answer that question. You'll be okay. So last part of this particular one is going to be presidents. Ooh, but before we hit that, Bethany, you mentioned a fantastic long duration event there, immigration. And Hector, I think Reconstruction absolutely works. Immigration, folks, is not a period by itself, but of course, there's different kinds of immigration, right? There's the initial immigration of all the settlers. But we don't really call that immigration as much as migration because there's not really an established country, right? But there is the early or the first immigrants, the old immigrants, and those are going to be the Irish and the Germans during the 1840s and 50s before the Civil War. The so-called new immigration is then going to be the 1880s, 90s, and early 1900s with Southern and Eastern Europe, the Poles, the Greeks, the Italians, the Jews, and people like that coming over. And of course, there's backlashes to both of those. And then there might be the modern day immigration, where there's a lot more from Latin America after the 1865 immigration overhaul under President Johnson. And you're going to see a lot more people from Asia, particularly from Southeast Asia after the Vietnam War, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, so lots of good stuff to talk about with immigration. I'm glad to see the chat's answering some good questions about that. Thank you much. So presidents, if you haven't Googled this, Google Jason Puit, and I believe Pruitt is spelled P-R-U-E-T-T-E-S. I'll put that in the chat as well. Jason Pruitt, President of the United States. That is if you just Google image search that thing, you can find this whole poster up there, and it's pretty fantastic. He made thumbprints of them, so the little like faces are made out of his thumbprint, which is not really the point. But what I love about it is that every single part of it, every single president is doing something that's fairly important to their particular presidency. And so it helps you not only memorize the order, but memorize just one thing about them. And so let me just go ahead and pull up one of those for you so you can see what it looks like. So let me exit out of this a second, and we'll get to the ones that I think you should know in just a little bit. And there's the Jason Pruitt's Presidents of the United States, all in its full glory. All right. Everybody able to see that okay? So George Washington, obviously, upper left-hand corner, you got him wearing his Army Commander's unit. Okay, that makes sense. He's the first president. Everybody knew that. But he led us through the American Revolution, and he's a general and a president. Also a big deal. Then John Adams. John Adams is holding a boat and also holding a book. John Adams was famous for writing a whole lot. He was influential in a lot of our founding documents. And then the boat could say it represents, let's say, the quasi-war that happens during that time. Aha. Or the fact that he was a diplomat and traveled to Europe all the time, right? So a lot of those are really important. And I'm not going to have time to go through all of these, but this is my favorite. I'm a visual learner. I really like to be able to see all of these presidents and to see something about them and the little visual pun, visual cue that goes along with them, right? So Teddy Roosevelt is speaking softly and carrying a big stick. He's also standing on a hill, as in San Juan Hill. Taft is an absolute unit. Woodrow Wilson's holding the world for peace and bringing democracy, making the world safe for democracy. President Harry Truman is wearing a policeman's uniform for the Korea police action. He's also holding the bomb for Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Let's see, we got Reagan holding a lightsaber for Star Wars. And then the last one is President Obama, the only non-white president, and he is holding a coin in his hand because he campaigned on a promise of change. I know, that's fantastic. I wish I could have come up with that. I can't take any credit, though. But yeah, he did add Trump later to a later poster, but I don't have that updated version. And it seems like in this case, he drew this during an early part of Obama's term anyway. So again, using a poster like this might be relatively helpful for you because that way you're able to see the presidents in order. For me, I can go, oh yeah, I know Abraham Lincoln's the end of the the end of the third line, right? Which is fantastic. But you also see that he's wearing a top hat and he's delivering the Gettysburg Address. So be aware that sometimes some visuals can really help. It can anchor you. Now, that being said, what's important about the presidents in general? Let me go back to here. So know your presidents and know your election years. That's my suggestion. as keep in mind, presidents, with some very notable exceptions, right, serve 4-year terms unless they resign, unless they dead, and a lot of it happens, right? So know your presidents in election years. If you know election years happen, and regardless, by the way, regardless of whether people die in office or resign, elections happen every 4 years. One of the miracles and amazing things about American democracy and our republic is that we have elections during wartime, during the Civil War. Lincoln runs for re-election, folks. That's a big deal. That's a really big deal. So if you know that it happens every 4 years, and you know that Jefferson's elected in 1800, you can go in 4-year increments. Was he reelected? Yes. Okay. Well, then I know he was president until another person was inaugurated in March, because it's March at that point, not January until after FDR, March of 1809. You know who was president during that time period. So what I'm suggesting that you do is, if you know some of these presidents, I suggest you know a couple of various categories here. And I know people that really like presidents might hate on me for this. Other teachers might have different methods. This is my personal suggestion, and I take absolutely no blame for anybody that wants to disagree with this. But Washington through Jackson are people that I think that you should memorize. So you should memorize the first 7 presidents, right? I also think that you can skip a few, go to Lincoln, and go Lincoln through Hayes. You absolutely must memorize those. Those are very important for Reconstruction. And then I think you should also memorize McKinley to the present, just because, remember, period 7 and period 8 are just absolute units, and they're huge. They're really important. And if you can memorize all of the presidents, it's really helpful. So why is memorizing presidents super helpful? Well, because if you know when they're elected, again, my example of 18, let's say, well, let's change it up this time from 1817. Let's make 1874. What happened in 1874? I don't know, but it was before 1877, let's say. So I know it was during Reconstruction. Also, who was president? Well, first we had Lincoln. He gets shot. Johnson takes over. Johnson is not reelected on his own. So then next comes Grant. Okay, so Grant was president in 68 to 72. Was he reelected? Yes. Okay, so then we have Grant being reelected. What do I remember about Grant's presidency? There was some corrupt stuff, some sort of ring scandal, trying to enforce the laws down south to keep the KKK down. There was, economy was not great. Oh, yeah, that's right. There was a panic of 1873. It's probably still going in 1874. Absolutely. And, oh, hey, fantastic. DW, you mentioned that already. Yeah, that's where I was going. So, again, if you don't know that there was a panic in 1873, and let's be honest, that's not at the top of your dates to memorize list, you want to make sure that you at least know who's president, and that way maybe you can logic or reason your way to where you need to be. Making sense so far, people with me? All right. So those are presidents, and I'll give you some examples in just a little bit. Allow me to quick pop into the questions and see what we have and what's going on. So questions so far. Important court cases. Yeah, Marbury v. Madison's a big deal. Plessy v. Ferguson's a big deal. Brown v. Board is a big deal. They had a lot of those early on. Again, Marbury, with all the important court cases, by the way, I think that you could say that there are dates with them that you could memorize, and some of those are useful. For example, Brown v. Board, I would argue, is really important. But I don't think I would worry too much about memorizing all of those dates. As long as you know the era in which they are and you know the context, that'd be useful. Let's see. So some other questions we're going to get to. Oh, that good old complexity point. If you were to write about the Civil War and its effects compared to World War II, then what dates or key points would you use? Well, the aftermath of the Civil War, keep in mind, is Reconstruction. So you want to go until 1877, start when the Civil War starts in 1861. That's a big date. And then if you compare it to World War II, keep in mind World War II begins in 1914, U.S. joins in 1917, and the war ends in 1918. But the after effects, I mean, depending on what the prompt tells you, and by the way, always answer the prompt. AP stands for answer the prompt, right? I mean, not really, but that's what we always tell our students. You want to make sure that you stay within the parameters there. And yeah, you go all the way from after World War I. The effects could extend into the 1930s and World War II, right? Because World War II doesn't happen without World War I. And I like DW. I like the way you put that. U.S. Reconstruction versus Europe's Reconstruction. Absolutely. I don't think that would be a question. It seems a little bit too obtuse, but it's a fairly good one to be thinking about. Absolutely. So let me go back to this a second, and let me give you some examples because we're running a little short on time here. So I used this one yesterday to talk about, all right, how do you get inside the exam and how do you know what they're trying to get you to talk about? Well, in this case, if you notice the chart, it's in the 1800s and it's immigration, and it's the 1840s and 1850s. If you see the 1840s and 1850s, yeah, then you need to know that it's about the Germans and about the Irish immigrating to the United States, and that'll get you absolutely. Same thing with this one, by the way. Same thing. Sriram, this is going to end in about 15 minutes or so, about 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's about an hour long, give or take a little bit, but feel free to stay as long as you want. So this one right here, John C. Calhoun in 1844. Now, again, 1844 is a date we've already brought up today, and yesterday we talked about how you should recognize John C. Calhoun as a slavery as a positive good guy. Well, now I want to emphasize the date. So 1844, we said that was the, the election of James K. Polk. So you know that the nation is talking about slavery. You know that the nation is talking about the Mexican-American War. The nation's all hyped up about this, and it's all talking about Texas. It's talking about Manifest Destiny, annexation, all of that. That gives you a fantastic context for this. And if you didn't know who John C. Calhoun was, you could probably guess by 1844 and seeing that date that, yeah, chances are pretty good that dude's concerned with slavery, at least a little bit. We talked about this one, Betty Friedan, and she's talking about an address to fighting for women workers in 1950. If she was fighting for women's workers in the 1800s, she'd be maybe talking to some Lowell Mill girls. But if she's talking to women workers in the 1950s, well, then she's probably talking about people who want to get back in the workforce after World War II. She's talking to people who want equal pay. Perhaps there's some ERA stuff stirring. You never know. And then once you read it, you discover that you were probably correct. 1775, Quaker leaders. Now, this is a little bit interesting because we said yesterday that Quakers are all about pacifism. But in this case, 1775, if you don't remember, 1775 was Lexington and Concord, and that's okay. You can definitely remember that it's the year before 1776, aka a big deal because of T-Paine's Common Sense, Thomas Paine, but also more importantly, the United States Declaration of Independence. That's a big deal, right? You got to know that one. So he's talking to the Colonial Assembly. The United States has not yet declared independence, or at least the colonies haven't. The United States doesn't exist yet, right? So that gives you a sense of when this is happening, and that should be fairly useful. Let me give you a couple examples of short answer questions and now LEQs and DBQs. This short answer question, if you see the dates 1607 and 1754, that should hit you in the face and say, ooh, Jamestown and the start of the 7 Years' War. They're interested in British colonial stuff. Now, they tell you British colonies in there, but that should also tell you, okay, I don't want to be talking about Columbus. I don't want to be talking about the Columbian Exchange. I want to be talking about the Triangle Trade. I also don't want to be talking about the Stamp Act. I don't want to be talking about the end of salutary neglect, right? So the British colonies in the Chesapeake and in New England are during this time period. We already talked about that and all those differences. Absolutely. This was a free response question. All of these are freely released on the College Board website. Why did new conservatism rise to prominence in the United States between 1960, 1989, and 1960? Now, here's your bonus question for the night. In the chat below, tell me why 1960 is an important date for conservatism. What do you got? Barry Goldwater is 64. He's kind of around. But 1960, what's going on in 1960 that might be important to the rise of conservatism? Why would they start it there? Why would they tell you? Drop something in the chat if you can about what's going on in 1960 as opposed to maybe a little bit earlier. Let's see, we got a lot of civil rights stuff going on. That's true, but remember, the civil rights movement's been going on for a while, and scholars debate, but it might happen in 1954, right, with the Brown v. Board decision. Goldwater, Milton Friedman, yeah. ERA's in the background. Vietnam's in the background with more advisors. Great Society's coming up. It's coming up. But for sure, they want you to include that. They want you to include, GW says Kennedy elected leading to Johnson and Great Society. Indeed. And who does Kennedy beat in the election of 1960 with the first televised debate and some fairly close calls, especially in Chicago? Mr. Kennedy. Who does Kennedy beat in the election of 1960? That's going to be Richard Milhouse Nixon. So keep in mind that he beats Nixon, and then Nixon will come back, and Nixon, through the Southern strategy and his dog whistle politics that some people mentioned, are definitely going to be a part of that. Helen, I also like your point too. The counterculture is a big deal. When you think of the 60s as a decade, right? You got the hippies, you got the sexual revolution, you have drugs and rock and roll, and of course the conservative movement is partly a backlash to a lot of that stuff, saying, wow, these are a lot of our traditional values that are changing and we don't like them. Absolutely. So here's another one. This comes from an SAQ interpretation, 1865 to 1900. It tells you business leaders of 1865 to 1900. That should immediately scream, of course, Gilded Age, Second Industrial Revolution. I'm talking Carnegie, Morgan, Rockefeller, those kind of gentlemen. Can't really talk about Henry Ford in this one. He's a little bit later. Don't mention the moving assembly line. That's something that dinged a lot of students on this one. I had some friends that did this one. You should not be talking about Henry Ford here or the moving assembly line. Some of that just doesn't really fit, and that's a problem. So robber barons, captains of industry, absolutely. Right here, this was a great one. Factor that increased tensions between Great Britain and its North American colonies. They ask you for 3 of them. There were a lot of DJ Khaled memes after the APUSH exam. Once this was released, of course, that said, that one in question that said, and another, and another, and another. And that's a big deal. 1763, that's the end of the 7 Years' War, end of salutary neglect, the beginning of all those acts. This is going to be the proclamation line. That should give you, if you know 1763, which is a pivotal turning point that you must know, then you have a bunch of ideas up your sleeve. And you can mention the Tea Act, the Stamp Act, and all of those, and virtual representation. Absolutely. But you don't necessarily know that those are the proper ones, and it just helps you along the way, because you could mention the proclamation line of 1763, and that would work. The end of salutary neglect. All of the acts. Absolutely. And Zane, yeah, I am counting on you folks to make good memes. By the way, please do not meme about anything until they're released. The prompts need to be released. Otherwise, those scores can get invalidated, and that's just really crappy. You wouldn't want that to happen to you, for sure. So a couple more, and then we'll take some questions and answers to round ourselves up, and we'll be almost done. So what are the causes of a rise of a women's rights movement in 1940 to 1975? All right, this one's on you folks. Rise of women's rights, 1940 to 1975. What sort of topics do they want us to include? I'll start us off. 1940 is World War II, or before it, right? Before the United States joins anyway in 41. So they want us to talk about women working during World War II. Thank you, Sander. Nice job. They want us to talk about suburbia. Sounds good. The waves, the walks, women getting involved in the armed forces, return to conformity in the 50s and the post-war era. Love it. Love it. You folks are doing well. Rosie the Riveter. Yes, all of that is vocab you can use on your essay. So please do. Absolutely. Movement, Levittown. Sounds good. Suburbs. They might be involved there, and ERA itself. Yep, the civil rights movement. Hey, don't forget women are involved in the civil rights movement, right? In both the La Raza movement, in the movement of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Absolutely. A lot of that kind of stuff. Feminine Mystique, Ms. Magazine, all of those work. Sounds good. You folks are killing it. Good job. So, one last game, then some questions. Betty Friedan works too, by the way. Yeah, good job. So, here's the game. Guess the topic based on the dates that I give you. So, a theoretical prompt that ends with these 2 dates. By the way, Annie, if you're still watching, we already talked about this, so you can't play. If it's 1808 to 1860, What do you think is the topic based on the importance of those two dates? Okay, slavery or antebellum reform movements is what I'm seeing so far. Sectionalism, Revolutionary era. Peyton, it's a little bit late for that. Revolutionary era, I'd say, is over certainly by 1800, if not by the end of the Revolutionary War era. The road to Civil War, Manifest Destiny, expansion, Second Great Awakening. All of that stuff is happening. You folks are good. Era of good feelings is in there. Politics could be. But because I gave those specific dates, I think I'm going to go with the slavery one. Here's the answer. It could be about slavery because remember 1808 is the end of the slave trade. I know that's a little bit of a deeper cut there in terms of the dates, but it could be useful. And then 1860 is the end of the antebellum era because then it begins the whole Civil War right after that with the election of Abraham Lincoln, right? But of course, this could also be antebellum parties, but then they wouldn't choose 1808. All right, here's another one. Made it a little easier for you. 1865 to 1877. I'll just give this to you because we're running a little short on time. This is just Reconstruction, right? End of the Civil War, end of Reconstruction. 1873 to 1800. Drop it in the chat. What do you think that one's all about? 1783 to 1800. I know there's a little bit of a lag. I'm seeing a lot of Reconstruction. That's the one that I gave you. Yep. I'm glad you folks know that one. That's good. If they gave you those dates, it's technically during the Gilded Age, but yeah. Articles of Confederation, early politics, before the election of Jefferson, U.S. government formed, Constitution, post-revolution. Ooh, you folks are fantastic. Good job. Good job. Yes, this is the critical period, the end of the revolution. Jefferson's election is the end. So this is the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, Jefferson, and the Washington and Adams administration before we get to Jefferson. Absolutely. Anti-Federalist, Federalist. You folks are great. One more for you. This one right here. Little trickier, but can you get it? 1793 to 1850. By the way, while I'm waiting for this, couple of good point, Aaron. By the way, while we're waiting, one of my students, I forget who, pointed out that you can actually take a random number generator and put in any dates that you want as like a number, and then put it into Google, and you can say, give me a number between 1788 and 2010, let's say, or 2010 and 1788, and then have a random number generator, and every time you random number generate, it gives you a new date to think about. Let's see, cotton gin invented. Yes, you got it. That's the first part. Economics. Yeah, maybe first industrial revolution. It's antebellum. There might be some slavery stuff involved. First two-party system. That's all happening during this time. But I need to go back into the chat and figure out who that was. Yeah, Aaron. Oh, of course it was Aaron. Aaron, you're just on fire tonight, aren't you? This is about the cotton gin. Absolutely. So cotton gin is invented in 1793, or at least patents involved. So yeah, this is going to be market revolution kind of stuff. And then 1850 is before the heavy industry of the Civil War era. So again, I think dates are important. They're useful. It's not like you have to brute memorize a whole bunch of them, but at least be able to put them into large categories. If somebody gives you something up from the 1500s, you should be able to go, oh, period one, and the Columbian Exchange was a big deal, and that should lead you on a rabbit trail to a bunch of other stuff. All right, so that's I had one more bonus one. Sorry about that. That's Cold War pre-Vietnam, right? So end of World War II to the year before the Gulf of Tonkin. I forgot about that one. That one's a little bit more recent one. Thought I'd get into the period 8 stuff. So other questions and concerns, feel free to ask those. We got just a few minutes here. We're almost ready to wrap up. Thanks for sticking around if you have so far. I'm hopefully going to be able to do a couple more streams next week. Mr. Ritchie will be back as well as per usual. There may be some other bonus ones. Always be checking Fiveable if you want to get access. It's only $5 a month to Fiveable Plus, actually, so you can get access to all of the other ones back streamed if you want to do those, if you will, as well. So that's pretty much a deal. Thank you so much for coming. Let's see. A couple of questions just to end with those. Esther asks, if we mess up a date on an LEQ or DBQ, like they say 1800 to 1848, but you say something in your essay from 1850 by accident, will be marked completely wrong. Well, let me tell you this and say it this way. If you include a date and it's a minor error, not a big deal. If you write outside the prompt date, then it does not count, as in they will not give you credit. That doesn't mean you lose points. You never lose points. They'll just ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist. So that's why it's important to stay within the prompt if you possibly can. Let's see. Should we know important election dates? We already covered that. Absolutely. That's a great one. How far away does the time period need to be to get a complex understanding point on the DBQs and LEQs? Again, as Aaron kind of said, you can go for the synthesis point, but they've basically told us, and again, I've been a reader, and at the reading, the leadership basically said old-fashioned synthesis doesn't exist, the whole comparison thing. Just don't even try that. Try doing nuance, contradictory information, try including an antithesis paragraph, a paragraph that argues change and continuity, or does compare and contrast. That's the best way to do it. That'll be much, much, much better. Yeah, thanks for those of you who are putting up the president's posters and things like that. Well done in the chat there. All right, in terms of the short answer questions, what are the readers looking for? Abby, that's a great question to think about. You want to make sure that you are giving them specific vocab that answers the question, that you define, and that answers the question directly. That's huge. That's huge. It's got to answer the question. It's got to be from the right time period. It's got to be specific, and it's got to answer the question. Absolutely. Let's see. Somebody needs some advice in their school. They forgot everything from the first half. Should I watch individual chapters or just rewatch periods 1 through 5? I mean, Dara, you live your best life. You do you. But if you have time, the individual chapters is going to be a lot more helpful. They're going to be a lot more in depth. But if you only have time to watch 1 through 5, absolutely. Last bit of advice, folks, is going to be this. When it comes to the days before the exam, please make sure you stay hydrated. Make sure you're sleeping. Getting a good night's rest is really important the night before. Don't stay up all night cramming. It won't do you any good. You need to make sure you have a good breakfast. And of course, stay hydrated, so that way you can do well on the exam. Thank you very much for coming, folks. And hopefully we'll be back with some more streams next week. Tune in, same place. I can't say necessarily the same time, but pay attention to your emails. Pay attention to the Liveable calendar, the Twitter sphere, the Reddit, subreddit, wherever these things get posted. Follow along there wherever you came to us. Thanks for stopping by, and best of luck. I hope you do really well on your APUSH exam. My name's been Mr. Lagerway. Thanks for joining us on this APUSH journey tonight. And I hope that you folks have a great rest of your evening.